There are three mindsets that I'd like to talk about in this time we have together. Since there was this HBR article that essentially led to this honor of being invited to give this talk, maybe I'll give a bit of an introduction to how this came about. And I'll start at the beginning. I mean the very beginning. So in addition to being born at the CMC hospital in Vellore and starting life with a hospital card that says Mina's baby, I actually had the privilege of growing up in the building in which Dr. Ida Scudder founded a CMC as a one-bed dispensary in 1900, and the building now houses the offices and directors' residence of the Christian Counseling Center. So like the kids I grew up with, I was basically embedded in a faith-based ecosystem of nonprofits that was in one way or another related to healthcare. And then I finished high school and left home, eventually becoming a business school academic, first in the UK and then in China, as you heard. But then last year, the COVID outbreak resulted in me coming back to this building that I grew up in, and what was intended to be a short stopover ended up becoming a 6-month stay. And that was an opportunity I had to reflect on my roots. And I was quite convinced that there were important lessons from this world of nonprofits that would be relevant to the world of business. And this conviction was because over the previous 5 years, I had begun to get very interested in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that had become an agenda for the world, and in particular, this idea of partnering for the goals, the 17th SDG. As all of you, I'm sure, are very aware of, it was on the 25th of September, 2015, that the Sustainable Development Goals were formally adopted by the United Nations. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, described these goals as a universal, integrated, transformative vision for a better world. Fast forward 4 years to the 25th of September 2019, and his successor, Antonio Guterres, called upon the world to treat the 2020s decade as a decade of action, to renew with greater vigor and urgency efforts to pursue these Sustainable Development Goals. And on that same day, Bill Gates made an important speech in which he implicitly drew attention to the contribution of CMC's community health work, which had resulted in admirable SDG outcomes in Vellore district. And I stumbled upon a video clip of the speech during that sojourn in Vellore last year. And that triggered the idea that maybe there was something to be gleaned from digging into the community health work. And thanks to the excellent input I was fortunate to receive from Dr. Abram Joseph and others, coincidentally, exactly a year later, on the 25th of September 2020, this article appeared in the Harvard Business Review. And for those of you who have read it, you will know that I talk about 3 principles that the world of business, I believe, can learn from how CMC has gone about doing things, pursuing some goals in a sort of intermediate, oblique way, embracing seemingly contradictory objectives such as affordability and quality, and then doing more with less in a frugal, or some may call austere, manner. Now, this was an attempt to take insights from the world of the nonprofits and share them with the world of for-profit business. What I'm going to attempt to do in this talk is the reverse. I would like to draw upon some ideas from my research from the world of business and try and distill from that 3 key ideas. Because in this decade of action, the pandemic has made it even more important, I believe, to try to be very enterprising in how we go about trying to have a greater social impact on the world. And as George has kindly already described, my work deals with partnering between small companies and large companies. I want to distill from these, from this body of work, 3 key mindsets that I believe are important: entrepreneurial, collaborative, and global mindsets, which not only are relevant in the context of what I do, which is talk about or study small and big companies partnering, but more generally about organizational transformation and ultimately about having a social impact by contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll start with the entrepreneurial mindset. And I would imagine that most people, when you hear this term, would think of startups and entrepreneurs who are trying to pursue new opportunities. And if you look at what these people do and how they go about doing things, you will normally find 3 characteristics. One is proactiveness, taking the initiative, not waiting to be asked, not reacting. A second is innovativeness, thinking outside of the box, looking for creative solutions. And a third is risk-taking, that is acting without having certainty of outcomes. Now, this is not to say that one takes blind risks and is reckless. In fact, managing risk, sharing risk is an important part of this. But you have to accept that, of course, there is risk involved. But even beyond the narrow world of entrepreneurship and starting a new business, if you think about what Dr. Ida Scudder and many others have done in her wake, including the work of the community health department that I wrote about, you will see proactiveness, innovativeness, and risk-taking. And so being entrepreneurial isn't just for startups. It's really about a mindset which all of us can really adopt in what we do. And in the context of established companies, this notion that you still can be entrepreneurial has given rise to this term called intrapreneurship, which is about adopting entrepreneurial attitudes inside of a bureaucratic organization. And one of the classic examples of this in a big company called 3M that you're all familiar with, I'm sure, is the story of how these ubiquitous yellow sticky notes, the Post-its, came about. It actually was the result of an intrapreneur called Dr. Silver Spencer, who had sort of an unsuccessful outcome in one of his attempts to develop a new adhesive, but was very intrigued by this semi-sticky substance, which he felt convinced would have some application, but he was struggling to find out what that might be. And in his spare time, during the lunch breaks, he would do brown bag presentations to other colleagues, describing what he had found and encouraging people to think about how this could be used. A few years later, another manager called Art Fry, who used to sing in a choir and felt very frustrated with the bookmarks slipping out from the hymn book, came up with the idea of maybe using that funny semi-sticky substance to create notes that would be temporary bookmarks. And that in the end resulted in the Post-it notes. And 3M have institutionalized this intrapreneurship within their company by allowing employees to have 15% of their time to work on projects that they're interested in that could be of value to the company. Now, this isn't easy to do. If it were, everybody would be doing it. But for at least 3 reasons, this is not easy. First of all, organizations hire managers. They don't hire entrepreneurs. And organizations tend to resist change. Finally, they tend to also not have systematic mechanisms to encourage this. So intrapreneurs, people, and this is not just confined to the for-profit world for sure, can try to still instill a sense of entrepreneurial behavior when they have knowledge of the internal and external environment. Knowing the external environment is important to be able to identify opportunities. Knowing the internal environment of the organization is important to figure out what the obstacles will likely be, what the politics they have to deal with is. They, of course, have to be visionary and willing to change the status quo. They have to be diplomatic because you need to get people on board within the organization, including people who have different areas of expertise, have the ability to build a professional support network, even outside of the organization, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to persevere even in the face of uncertainty and setback. Now, and I want to give you a role model of an intrapreneur that I have come across. And when you see what I just put on the screen, if you're thinking of Jesus of Nazareth, I think that's a very good thought. I think this is good advice at a general level, and I'm pretty sure if we think hard, we will find proactive, innovative, and risk-taking behaviors in the life of Jesus. But that's a talk and maybe a sermon for another occasion. I am thinking of someone else who I actually met in Berlin and took a selfie with. And this is a guy called Jesus Del Val, who works for this big fuddy-duddy German pharmaceutical company that makes aspirin called Bayer. And Jesus, who comes from Havana, Cuba, he arrived penniless in Germany many years ago, did a PhD, he's a scientist sort of bloke, but at Bayer, he came to the realization that it was important to start fostering a capability in digital health. And in 2012, he just started with this very small initiative to have meetups in Berlin and try to attract people with an interest in digital health to come along, many of whom were actually students. And the following year, he started a program called Grants for Apps, encouraging these young students to make apps, mobile phone apps, that could be, that would have a digital health application. And so this was somebody who didn't have this in his job description. It's not even in his training. He's not a business guy, but he took it upon himself because he had an idea to be proactive, innovative, and take a bit of a risk to stick his neck out and get a program like this started. And so the question to be thinking about is, how do we keep alive the spirit of intrapreneurship as our organizations mature? And I think that's as relevant to an organization that's over 100 years old like CMC, as much as it is to a nonprofit in Vellore that's just about a decade old. As organizations mature, routines ossify, it's important to keep revitalizing and renewing a spirit of entrepreneurship within the organization. But good entrepreneurs realize that they can't do everything on their own. And that leads me to the second of the three mindsets, the collaborative mindset. There are three things that I have consistently seen good entrepreneurs who are collaborative do. First of all, they leverage networks actively. This is sort of an extension of being proactive that we talked about. They are good at using networks reflectively. There is often a tendency to think of network relationships in a very narrow way. A network connection is good for me only if I get a specific opportunity from it, a job lead or a new business deal. And I think it's important to keep a strong focus on these kinds of benefits. But in the long run, the most sustainable benefit is actually what we learn through our network relationships and the knowledge we imbibe. And imbibing that knowledge actually takes effort and thoughtfulness. And thirdly, people who leverage their network relationships well and collaborate well with others recognize that different network relationships are good for different things. I find the distinction that professor at Harvard University, Robert Putnam, makes very useful. He makes a distinction between bonding relationships with people who are similar to us on some key dimension. For faith-based organizations, it may be other faith-based organizations, and these relationships are good because it's easy to build trust. But there is another benefit that comes from the actors that are dissimilar from us, the bridging relationships, and that is novelty of information, ideas, and opportunities. And so achieving a sort of a balance between these is often what is key when it comes to collaborating with others. And in a way, that's what I've been studying with large companies, working with small companies. They're both sets of actors are going outside of their comfort zone. Yet I will be the first to admit that this isn't easy. And what I find in my research is there's a paradox of asymmetry. The very differences that make highly dissimilar partners attracted to each other to work together also makes it difficult for them to work together. And that is in fact what my book is trying to address. But for our purposes tonight and today and at this point, what I would point out is that collaborative intrapreneurs find a way around this. And I come back to Jesus and his work at Bayer with the Grants for Apps Digital Health Program, which, as I said, started in 2012 in a very small way. In 2013, they started giving away small grants to students to develop digital apps. But then the realization dawned on Jesus that there was scope to collaborate in a wider way. And so he started inviting a group of European startups to come and spend 3 months in a couple of offices within the Bayer building. And I've been there. It's nothing fancy. There was no massive addition of resources or anything, but they found the interaction with these startups mutually beneficial. In 2015, they opened this up to startups from anywhere in the world. In 2016, they made it a bigger program. And then in 2017 and 2018, added other elements to this and encouraged Bayer branches in other parts of the world like Spain, Russia, China, so on, to follow suit. But do note, it started with a very small step that one individual took. And it reminds me of this quote by Simon Sinek: dream big, start small, but most of all, start. And I think that's the intersection of being entrepreneurial and being collaborative, finding ways to get going by reaching out to dissimilar others. And I'm finding a lot of organizations beginning to think like this. My last business trip at the end of 2019 was to Israel, and one of the most fascinating organizations I visited was the Sheba Hospital there, which many of you, I'm sure, have heard about. And just a month before, they had inaugurated what they call the Arc Innovation Center, which was one of its major objectives was to engage with digital startups in Israel to try to improve their technologies for the benefit of patients. Another organization that you will all be very familiar with is Johns Hopkins University, which has an accelerator program to support startups, both early stage and later stage. And of course, as an educational institution, it's trying to help startups where one of their students or alumni are involved. And then because of COVID, in fact, digital health startups and entrepreneurship has had a boost. Just last month, there was this article in the Hindu's Business Line newspaper talking about this. And one of the organizations that I've come across partners with Cisco, the big IT company from California that has what they call a launch pad program in Bangalore to help support startups, one of which is called Cloud Physician, which was set up in Bangalore by two Indian doctors who are intensivists who returned from the US, and set this up to basically help provide remote support for ICUs, not in big hospitals like CMC, but smaller hospitals in smaller towns. And of course, their services were used heavily in this period of the pandemic. And another very interesting digital health startup that I heard about through my work with Microsoft comes from Pakistan and is called Sehat Kahani, Story of Health. And what's interesting about it is not only do people who don't easily get access to healthcare, medical advice, get access, but on the supply side, the doctors that they're tapping into are typically women doctors who stop working after they get married and are now able to provide time at their convenience in a way that works for them remotely. And again, with the explosion of telemedicine, this has been a huge help. And I think Dr. Ida would have greatly approved because not only does this contribute to SDG 3 of good health, but also SDG 5 of gender of combating gender inequality. And of course, there are limits to what these startups can do. You know, nobody's going to be able to accomplish a surgery through these kinds of things. But my point is, going back to Jesus and Bayer and these big fuddy-duddy companies, they are clearly trying to imbibe a collaborative spirit that takes them outside of their comfort zone. And so the question to think about is, how do we access and leverage external complementary capabilities, including from unlikely allies? And now, finally, the third idea I want to briefly talk about is the notion of a global mindset. You know, as a result of curiosity to know more about the world, the competence to be able to deal with different cultures and having connections, people like Jesus at Bayer have been able to engage with startups in different parts of the world, in Spain, Russia, China, the United States. But an example that I want to give you is actually from Africa. This is a picture that Jesus posted of him with a guy called Randolph Owusu, who he describes as the Mark Zuckerberg of Africa. Randolph and a co-founder set up a company that they call BISA, which has it's a healthcare app that allows people to get just some basic information and advice, targeting poorer people who don't have access to healthcare. It was started in 2014 during the Ebola crisis, when Ghana was greatly afraid that there would be infections coming in from Liberia, which for them, fortunately, did not happen. But the BISA app then got the attention of Bayer in 2016. Jesus invited them to be part of this Grants for Apps Accelerator in Berlin that we talked about. And so Jesus introduced me to Randolph. And when I went to Ghana, where my school has a small campus, to teach, I had the opportunity to meet Randolph and his co-founder. And what amazed me most of all was what a humble, ramshackle building in which they had this little room in which they were operating out of. And I thought, you know, having had the privilege of visiting some sparkling startup facilities in the likes of Silicon Valley and Israel and so on, you know, there are people who are working their socks off and trying to be entrepreneurial, trying to be collaborative, and have this global mindset, both in terms of these young entrepreneurs like Randolph, but also these intrapreneurs in larger organizations like Jesus. Now, it might sound a little odd for me to be waxing eloquent about a global mindset at a time when globalization has got bad press. And I want to take us back to the building in which I grew up and offer you two contrasting views of what globalization can look like. On the one hand, there is the origins of this building as an indigo factory that was built by the East India Company. The East India Company, as Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University often says, is a model of exploitative, rapacious globalization. But on the other hand, this is also where CMC was literally a startup in 1900. And today, another nonprofit working in the area of mental health, the Christian Counseling Center, operates. And coincidentally, my dad, who is the director, marks 50 years to the day when he joined this organization as a young man. And so this is the sort of selfless service that the CMC ecosystem has developed, which I think is, and you know, the forces of globalization facilitated the East India Company, but also the work of missionary families like the Scudder, the developments in transportation and technology and so on. And so for me, it's about how we harness globalization and make it a force for good. And so in terms of this global mindset idea, it is about how we imbibe and use the best ideas from around the world, which, by the way, people from the Vellore ecosystem have been very good at. But I would also just add, and not just from the easy to reach familiar faces, the English speaking West. I think there are interesting ideas and inspiration to be gained from elsewhere too. And so as I wrap up, as I see it, these three mindsets together can help organizations revitalize in this decade of action by cultivating intrapreneurs within, by engaging with partners on the outside, and searching widely for inspiration, and seeking to do this in ever more effective and smarter and fresh ways. But of course, there are always specific contexts that each organization faces. And so as we think about these, one has to obviously take into account the specific organizational culture, the resource constraints, the local realities that one faces. Finally, and this is my final slide, I discovered to my great surprise that last week was something called Global Intrapreneur Week. I'd never heard of it. And apparently, they describe themselves like this, from CEOs to shamans and so on. We're a platform to bring together connections with unlikely allies. And I thought, in that statement are these three mindsets that we just talked about. And I want to close with this quote from one of the speakers at this event last week. If we don't collaborate today, there may not be a playground to play on tomorrow. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your comments and questions, George.
Thank you, Dr. Prashantham. That was a wonderful lecture, and we thank you again. It is time for the audience to put the questions so that we can ask them to Dr. Prashantham. Let me lead off with the first question. Intrapreneurship is a powerful concept in the for-profit sector, as you've said. The question is, when we transfer that to not-for-profit sector, which typically have very limited resources, emphasis on frugality, and also very few opportunities and means to reward the entrepreneurs with certainly economic rewards. What are the challenges? What are the best practices in being able to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was in Vellore and working on that article that led to the HBR piece, one of the books that I looked at was this fantastic, coffee table style book, which is a history of CMC Vellore. And reading through it, I would say, there's a lot of very interesting insights into Dr. Ida Scudder as the founder, as the founding entrepreneur, if you will. But there were a lot of stories beyond that in terms of the work of both other Western missionaries, but also Indian doctors and leaders who came along, all of whom I would describe as intrapreneurs. One of my favorites is the story of Dr. Paul Brand, who revolutionized the way leprosy is treated, basically came up with a very different approach. And in today's business nomenclature, we might say, resulted in a spin-off organization being created. And so I think historically, we see this already happen, that this has already happened in nonprofits. One of the buzzwords that I came across in the last few months actually is social intrapreneurship. And in fact, now even in for-profit organizations, there's a recognition that there should be some clear social impact outcomes even in the for-profit world. But an important question you asked, though, is what about the rewards? I just finished writing a case study about an intrapreneurship program that was introduced in Intel China over the past 3-4 years. And one of the things that these people found that astonished them was that what it took to motivate these Intel China engineers to get into this program and contribute had very little to do with money and a lot to do with noticeable impact. Now these guys are not talking about social impact per se, but just to be able to see that the work that they do results in products that are actually used and launched in the marketplace makes a big difference. So I think there are, so my answer to this is twofold. One is that, yes, it is actually very important in nonprofits. And two, I increasingly find non-monetary rewards being, in fact, what is really the ability to observe that what you're doing is useful and impactful, I think, is actually a very powerful motivator.
Thank you. A second question from the audience goes to your collaborative mindset. And there the question relates to when people from with different goals and values come together, how does a not-for-profit organization or an organization in general put them together to get them to work together to advance the goal of the particular organization? Especially, you can imagine from, let's say, Christian entrepreneurs, you can imagine several unlikely allies that the organization needs to attract and bring in under the tent, if you will. Are there different good strategies for that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I was chuckling when I heard the reference to especially when you come from a Christian background. The greatest thing that happened to me, I feel, is that I grew up in Vellore with this remarkable set of values. One of the most challenging things that's happened to me is I grew up in Vellore with this remarkable set of values. And when I went to college after high school, I read economics in college. In the beginning, I simply could not get the concept of economic man, the idea of rationality, which is that people seek to maximize utility in a highly monetized fashion, because it was so contrary to anything I had observed in CMC. And so actually it took me a long time to get my head around this. So I think that is both a strength, but also an interesting weakness, I think, a little bit, now that I have had the opportunity to understand the other side, because the other side is actually not as dark and evil as is necessarily perceived, and as George, you personify very well as the CEO of a financial company. But I think what this primarily reflects is this idea that we're dealing with asymmetries, right? And in this case, it's also asymmetries of philosophical positions or norms and so on. What I have observed is the following. The important thing is to understand what the asymmetries are and then find ways in which to address them. So for example, one of the levels of asymmetry has to do with goals. We want different things. And in fact, it's not just we want different things, we might even approach them in very different ways. Larger organizations, we approach them in a very sort of slow, process-oriented way. And a young company with not much resources, or even a non-profit, if they don't get an answer very quickly, and if they don't get money in the bank having done the work, they will die. So you have asymmetries around goals. You may have asymmetries around the structure of the organization. It's hard to find counterparts. It's frankly difficult also in terms of asymmetry of attention that each party is willing to give to the other. And so what I've observed in where these collaborations have happened against the odds is that efforts are made to then address this. For example, in terms of the goal asymmetry, to specify very clearly what the win-win is, what is the synergy. In terms of the structure asymmetry, to identify some sort of interface. How are we going to actually structure and manage this relationship? And in terms of these, the attention asymmetry, to figure out how to showcase success stories so that it becomes clear what a successful relationship could look like. And of course, I think in this regard, the larger, more powerful organizations are better able to set the tone. And so for those who have the power to do that, that's what they should do. And the organizations with less power should look out for organizations that have developed a competence and commitment to partnering well with less powerful actors. One other thing I would say very briefly is for those who are at the less powerful end, it is important to, I think, be innocent as doves and wise as serpents, meaning you try to do two things simultaneously, which is to put your best foot forward and exhibit the entrepreneurial behaviors and so on that we've talked about, but at the same time, operate with a certain level of caution because the plug may be pulled at any time, people may leave. And I find that a process of selective revealing, which is you don't basically give away everything that you have to offer, you act in a fairly shrewd way, is also part of how to address this.
Okay, thank you very much. You are in a unique position, Dr. Prashantham, of observing Vellore from different perspectives. First, as an individual and as a person growing up in the town of Vellore with your father, you said, and others as experiences. So from a personal perspective, and then you also have studied Vellore from a professional perspective. Are there examples of the three mindsets that you saw in Vellore? Anything that you can point to us?
I mean, I would say what I described in the HBR article itself. You can see these mindsets. For example, the setting, how Chad was making a big contribution into the MBBS curriculum and then impacting the not just the health aspects, but also the socioeconomic aspects of the surrounding villages and so on. That was proactive behavior, that was innovative, that was risk-taking. It involved collaborating. It involved collaborating with local government agencies and other nonprofit partners. I remember hearing about someone from Christian Aid, for example, who was very instrumental in helping pushing the envelope when it came to raising funds and so on. And I think it had a very global perspective. In fact, one of the people I spoke to even mentioned an example from China, the idea of barefoot doctors having, in the early stages somehow been inspirational to this idea, but also other, good practices being adopted. So I think right there you see these three mindsets. And I think in the wider ecosystem as well, in Vellore, which has fostered a whole bunch of nonprofits, faith-based nonprofits. You see this. One example I recently heard of, and I think the person who runs this organization called Hope House is in the audience. They do some fantastic work with children. They work with the child helpline, but they're also trying to develop an app. And so in this process, they've been engaging with CMC on the one hand, but also a bunch of engineering students from VIT who actually have the expertise to develop the app. Now, this is, of course, a small nonprofit dealing with three gorillas in a way, and I'm sure that's an interesting challenge. But again, I'm seeing exactly this. This is an entrepreneurial mindset. It's being collaborative. And I think this is very consistent with all the things I'm seeing globally. And I'm very encouraged after here, coming across some examples like this.
Thank you. Let me ask the other side of the coin. You've obviously highlighted a lot of strengths that Vellore has. What would you say to the leadership of Vellore about the things that they should be worried about and concerned about as they face the future in a country that's becoming not as friendly to a Christian institution as the country was at one time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very important issue. And even here in China, for example, there are all kinds of concerns about how one is perceived. Actually, here it's not about religion. We worship freely. And the reason I ended up in Vellore was my family and I had gone with a group from our church to Nepal during the Chinese New Year. And because of the pandemic situation, instead of coming back from China, we went across to India. And we were never worried about talking about our church connection in China. If at all we were worried, it was in Nepal. But here in China, for example, foreign companies are feeling the pressure and feeling that somehow they could be discriminated against. But in general, when one is doing undeniably good work that is having a social impact, even with an unfriendly kind of feeling in the broader atmosphere. In the end, people recognize, and this is both the common man and the government official, in my view, that this is important work. And so the key is to focus on continuing to do innovative, impactful, and good work, which CMC clearly has done during the COVID period, setting the standard. And I think two things are important then, really. It's to focus more on what we can do, what is within our control. And two things there are, first of all, in some senses, making sure that the leadership don't get in the way of innovative, interesting ideas that come from the bottom up. And then also step in and give air cover, because you can't just do everything in a bottom-up way. And Jesus at Bayer could only start in a bottom-up way to begin with. Ultimately, it needed senior leadership coming in from the top and helping to actually fructify things and expand them. And I think that's what any leadership should be doing, making sure they don't get in the way of the valuable bottom-up efforts, but when they see these, to also then the ones that can really work and make a difference, to come in and then set up ways in which these can be institutionalized, formalized, and amplified.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, and we are drawing close to the end of the hour, so this will be the last question. You've looked at organizations in several parts of the world. Have you seen other examples of institutions that follow the Vellore model, where doing more with less, and some of the other points that you mentioned? Have there been other examples that you've seen anywhere as you've studied other organizations?
So a lot of my recent work has been in an African setting in West Africa, and actually the resource constraints there are comparable, if not worse, than what we've seen in India. And there, I actually have seen a very interesting phenomenon of how social entrepreneurship is being encouraged. In the absence of the typical entrepreneurial ecosystem players that you have in the likes of Silicon Valley, for example, I don't know if people are familiar with names like Plug and Play and Techstars. These are organizations that help startups come up. I actually found that there was an NGO in Ghana called Reach for Change that was helping social entrepreneurs to develop solutions to help youth and children and so on. And so this idea is, I think, inevitable wherever you have resource constraints. And so this is something that this idea of frugal innovation actually is something that yes, one is seeing around the world, not because people like it that way, but because one has to be creative. And I think the key idea is therefore to focus, it's sort of focusing on the art of the possible and working within these constraints. And in some cases, actually the solutions that come up surprise everybody. I think on a positive note, the human spirit, the human capacity, and we've seen this in the time of pandemic, has great resilience. And, I think we should continue with optimism to not necessarily focus on the constraints in terms of what we don't have, but to leverage them to drive creativity and innovation.